A place is made up, its essence is made up of people.
I really picked up actually on the troublemaker, and I've got a question on that actually.
We underestimate to our own peril that actually class is as powerful as race.
If you're an activist, you want to stay and fight, you don't want to go.
Power should always be devolved. That's the safest bet.
Many people, like say with the climate struggle right now, can't think about the end of the world from climate change because they have to think about the end of the month and putting food on the table for their kids.
Yes, some of us lose our lives, some of us go to prison, some of us lose loved ones, and I've had a lot of all of that.
Kumi Naidoo grew up under apartheid in South Africa, where he became an activist at a very young age, fighting for justice and even living in hiding, and carrying the deep grief of losing loved ones along the way. From those early days of resistance, he went on to lead some of the world's most influential organizations, like Greenpeace, Amnesty International. Kumi's story reminds us that activism is not just about anger, it's about love, courage, and the belief that even in the darkest times, change is possible if we stand together.
I have to be honest, the first thing that shocked me is when I looked at your date of birth, and I thought my first question would be, what is your skincare routine? Because there is no way that was your date of birth. And honestly, I could not believe how much of a full life you've had. So I wanted to start though with the really starting point before all of this. What was Kumi like as a child? What were you like as a child?
Oh, I was mama's boy, but very close to my dad, who was a community person who was involved in organizing amateur football and cricket and so on. I was very, very boring and studious. And you would find it strange to know that I was the head prefect at my school.
Wow.
In my primary school, which meant that I was very much stick with the status quo, part of the establishment and so on. And I was very, very academic oriented because my parents, like many parents who from working class communities, believed that education was the route out of poverty and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And I followed the rules. Nobody would know. In fact, there'd be people who said, wow, the way you were as a kid and the way you turned out to be is completely different. Because when you was young, right until your mom died, you were very much like an establishment kid. You followed the rules. And then, of course, once I got involved in the struggle, I enjoyed breaking all the rules, and I've more than made up for the 15 years. My first 15 years, I've misbehaved appropriately since then. In fact, my book is called "Letters to My Mother: The Making of a Troublemaker."
Yeah.
So
I really picked up actually on the troublemaker, and I've got a question on that actually after. So you say that basically things turn or change when your mother passes away. Can you just tell me a bit how did that impact you? How did that change you?
So, I mean, it's probably the most traumatic event in my life. I felt that it was like a complete emptiness inside me.
Yeah.
And I just felt that I would never recover from it. And when people lose loved ones, those that find themselves friends, family, colleagues and all very well intentioned. They want to help, say the things to help you get out of it. So people were saying things like, she's in a better place, at least she's not in pain anymore. God picks his first flowers first, his best favorite flowers first. But in the midst of all of that, one of my father's friends who was an activist said to me, my boy, I don't know how you recover from this, but what I want to tell you is that irrespective of how sad and devastated you feel, there are people in our country, in our continent, Africa, and around the world who are in a significantly worse situation than you are. So my only advice I can give you is maybe you can recover from your mother's suicide by living with purpose. Use your life and use the intelligence that you've been given and so on to stand up for the dignity of other people. And by doing that, you'll find your own dignity in life and you'll recover from it. And I have to say that that was the best advice I got, and I followed it up to today. And it's not as if there haven't been devastating moments where I felt so weak and broken and so on. And sadly, suicide revisits my life quite often since then as well.
I mean, I know it doesn't compare in any way, shape, or form, but the only way I could kind of think of a personal experience that was quite similar, because I lost one of my very, very close friends when he was 26. And I can remember identifying with kind of nothing made sense. Also, in a sense, my life also kind of didn't make sense at that point. But what is weird is that it also took away a lot of barriers. So I suddenly also had a lot more courage to just do what I felt was right to do. And what's really interesting is that it's also when I started my activism. I also actually happened to dump my ex-boyfriend at the time and get with my partner then, so that was also a good choice. But I was wondering because I think at that time I didn't really connect the dots. Did you realize at that time, did you have a moment of realization, I'm gonna make purpose out of my life? Or is it something that happened in view of the kind of state of mind, and now you look back at it and you realize, okay, that was really what stimulated me? Or is it really a decisional point where you decided, okay?
I'm not sure that it was as conscious on a daily basis, but my mom's death coincided with a national student uprising. The high school students came out in large numbers. We were thrown up in that struggle. And the slogan at the front of the march was, "We want equality." This was equality in education. By the time the slogan got to the 12-year-olds at the Bathily, they were chanting, "We want color TV." Because they thought the slogan at the front of the march was, "We want a color TV." And honestly, at that time, I probably wanted a color TV and equality almost equally. I felt equally unattainable. So that conversation from 2 weeks earlier with this friend of my dad's about live with purpose, I had the opportunity to then say, hey, and at that time when you're traumatized by a loss like that, you think, oh, maybe my mother is giving me a sign that this is what I should do, and so on. And so I became a student activist, and then I was expelled from school, and then that, like most repression, it backfires against the oppressor. So expelling me from the school consolidated me to making me an activist. Because who knows, if I had not been expelled, maybe I would have got really good grades in high school, went to medicine or something like that. And maybe I would not have landed where I did. But thankfully, there's enough stupidity in the ranks of the oppressors that they take disproportionate repressive action, which generally backfires. Yes, some of us lose our lives, some of us go to prison, some of us lose loved ones, and I've had a lot of all of that. But at the end of the day, I would say the apartheid state directed me to resist it by how awful and horrific they were in the nature of the oppression against the majority of our people.
I mean, what was it like? Because you grew up, right, in an Indian township. What was it like living with this level of divide? Did you even have access, in a sense, to other cultures' realities, or
Very limited.
Okay.
Very limited. I mean, basically, the nature of apartheid was divide and rule, right? So it wasn't good enough saying blacks and whites. The blacks had to then be divided into Indians, coloreds, And not just Africans, by the way, Zulus, Xhosas, Swana, and so on, because divide and rule, like, is central to colonialist strategy, and apartheid followed that very well. And once I get involved in the struggle at the age of 15, we then start attending mass meetings in town, right? So when we went to town, we would then be predominantly amongst, in fact, we would be, my brother, myself, and the small group of activists from this Indian townships who are often were the smaller group of people, in predominantly people who were of African descent, and it was the most exciting thing as a teenager, like going there. We used to sing these songs in Zulu, right? And other African languages. 80% of the time, we didn't know exactly what the words meant, but it didn't really matter, because just the vibe and the energy and the police outside, the tear gas is about to come, with the baiting, the baitings to baiting charge you and so. At that age, there's also adrenaline that's pumping, right? And so I then, had a lot of contact in the movement, but that's such a good question, because you could have all of that in the city, but you had to retreat back to your own racial ghetto, right? So like in my township, you could go to exclusively Indian school, in a hospital that was just for Indians, on buses that were run, and similarly like that in the colored townships, in different African townships, it was the same. And the government knew that the worst thing would be if people could unite across those different boundaries. And when 3 years after my mom died, we launched a movement nationally called UDF, which stood for United Democratic Front, which was made up of women's organizations, youth organizations, and we had a youth organization that we set up called Helping Hands Youth Organization. And Helping Hands was part of the South African Youth Congress. And then, and then also, it was also engaging with people from different classes. Yeah. Right? Because Chatsworth, the area, the township I grew up, it was a working class township. So even engaging with Indian people of Indian background who were not from Chatsworth, it was like another whole tribe. Right? The cars the parents had, the language they used, the way they dressed, and so on. We underestimate to our own peril that actually class is as powerful as race, in dividing and controlling and so on. And so, of course, apartheid, if you're resisting apartheid, then you want to resist everything about it. And so, my friends used to jokingly say that, once I came back from exile at the age of 25, 26, that I did more than Nelson Mandela for racial reconciliation, because I always dated across the racial line.
No, it's a good one. No, but I think I'm honestly fascinated sometimes, because I think there is a reality where it could have been an easy route to also go in the racist route, right? And like just go for the privilege that you can hang on. And I'm quite fascinated in like why not, in a sense. But I'm actually wondering one thing, that because when I was reading about townships, I a few months ago, I actually went to Brazil and I visited like a favela with someone who's from there, etc. And it was honestly, it changed my perspective on many things, because I'm partly West African, and there's been a huge West African influence because many of the people enslaved came from that region. But what fascinated me is that the language the person was using was very familiar to the language that we would use. Like, you would talk about a lot the ancestries and how can we make them proud, etc. And I realized that there was a history to the favelas that was really linked to that colonialism. And in fact, something that was completely misunderstood was the community within, which I really identified with, because it really made me think of, I guess, my roots and our sense of community and how you build it, etc. And I was thinking about that, like, what was the community sense in the township, because people often, from the outside look at these places as like, oh, it must be just hell, or it must just be, poverty. And something that really shocked me in the favela was like, he said to me, this person, look, we don't want to leave, we just want to build it because we really love community. Exactly.
Yeah, no, I mean, see, the important thing to know is what you don't know, you don't miss, right? I had people from Europe sometimes say, hey, I was in Africa and I saw these kids. They had almost nothing. They were bare feet and so on in this rural area. And my God, they were just having so much fun. I never see kids in Europe having as much fun as they do, and so that's one reality of township. The second thing is, when people ask, is that a good place to live anywhere in the world? A place is made up, its essence is made up of people, not about the infrastructure and how big your house is and so on. And so I had the most amazing friends and, especially, after my mom took her life, I was 15, my friends sustained me. And then my friends became comrades. Yeah, and most of them did, right? And so those comrades in the struggle were family, and up to today, if I go to Durban, where I'm from, if I don't make it to my township at least once or twice to go see my friends who are still there, or at least spend 1 or 2 nights there, irrespective of where my meetings are, I feel like, oh my God, I didn't do what I was supposed to do. And so, and like the people in the favelas in Brazil, all we wanted was not to move to the white areas, or so-called white areas as it was in those days. We just wanted better communities where, there were sporting facilities, there was decent education, that there was health services and so on. And not to say that there was none of that, but the quality of it was very different from what the whites had. And yeah, I felt very, very loyal then, more so than now, obviously, as time wore on. But like say if I was in town, right, and there was a girl from my township that somebody harassed her. Whether I knew the girl or didn't know the girl, we were on top of that person because there was a sense of solidarity and community. And similarly like that, all the townships, irrespective of what specific race it was or the size and so on, people had a thing was, this is home. This is our home. And bad as it might be, this is the only home we know. So let's try and make it the best we can. And while we're here, we're not going to wake up everybody and say, oh my God, things are so bad, terrible. We're going to make the best of it. That's the human spirit. And people who are oppressed do not lack in human spiritedness. In fact, I believe they have more of it.
Yeah. I agree with you definitely from that. I'm wondering, because you go into exile, but for a while, you basically have to live in hiding. I honestly couldn't wrap my brain on how did you manage to continue your education, because you become a Rhodes Scholar. So how did you manage to continue your education in hiding, and what does in hiding actually mean? Like, what does it consist of?
So basically, the sad thing about being in hiding is you become your own prison warden.
Okay.
Right, in a sense. So for me, what it meant was, when a national state of emergency was imposed, and I was already out on bail for violating the state of emergency regulations, and I then have to go underground. So underground meant was I had to leave my home, find somebody who could take the risk of hiding you in their home. I was lucky at that time. I say I hid in various places, but one of the places I hid was at my one of the lecturers at my university's house. She had a small basement, very simple but perfect for a hiding place.
And basically, I was in solitary confinement, on my own, I couldn't tell my brother, I couldn't tell my sister, I couldn't tell my closest friends and so on. And if there were people who were going to come and see me, there were 2 or 3 people who knew. And they either had to tell the people to lie down in the back, or if they didn't trust them, they actually blindfolded them so they wouldn't know exactly, where they were being brought. And the hardest thing was not being able to get sunlight and get out in the day and so on, because by that stage, 1986, in the height of the state of emergency, they knew enough about me, and I'd done enough things to piss them off, basically. And so writing my exams, what did that mean? But by the way, being underground, and meaning that I was not like busybody running from one meeting to the other, also meant that I studied hard.
Yeah.
So which I absolutely had a cover for the whole year where I didn't study. So I studied very hard. And then writing the exams. Now, the army was at the university, 3 entrance to the university, roadblocks to every, into each of the university. And my surname is a very common surname in Durban. Right? But the white Afrikaner policemen who were running the roadblocks didn't quite fully understand that. So they would ask every car coming in, is there a Naidoo here? Is there a Naidoo here? And every other car had a Naidoo, because Naidoo was very common surname. So I felt sorry for those guys. That's good that they got. And so I had progressive lecturers. And how did I make it? Because there were teachers who were not defined as activists, but they did their bit. They took the risk to come to my house and teach me math, science, physics, and so on. They were activists who were good at certain subjects, helped me to study from textbooks and so on. And so I registered for an exam that, adults who drop out of school and they go back after a couple of years. And the reason I did that was, if I wrote it within the Indian education system, they had all my details. And the view that was that even if I got 6 firsts or 6 A's, that they would fail me to prevent me from going to university. So I quietly went with some of my closest comrades, registered for the exam, scraped past, really. I didn't get I didn't have a single A. The best grade I had is C. And then I had mostly D's. Oh, I had 1 B, right, for English. And so I made it to university, studied law, and studied political science. And then while I'm 4th year at university, the state of emergency is completely out of control. People are being arrested, disappearing, killed, and so on. And a professor of mine came and said, listen, why don't you just apply for a scholarship? You can go overseas, get some skills, and then you can come back and you'll be more effective in the struggle because you'll have more capability. At that stage, that's the last thing you wanted to hear. No, another, if you're an activist, you want to stay and fight, you didn't want to go. But then a activist who had spent 20 years on Robben Island with Mandela and had just come out, I got to see him in hiding while I was on the run. And then he said to me, I agree with the professor, go. And in any case, you're going to get arrested or put in prison for a long time. So rather than that happen, why don't you just go and get some skills? So I fled in 1987 at the age of 22, and I was back 3 years afterwards, 1 month after Mandela was released. Right? I discontinued my studies, came back home. And so the scholarship experience was another whole thing. I had friends who helped me prepare my applications and so on, because I was so crazy with being on the run and so on. And I didn't think I'm going to get the scholarship, which is why I probably got it. Basically, I'm from Durban, the interviews were Cape Town. So I got a flight to Cape Town. I was put in a hotel, right? As far as I was concerned, in my small world, I had already won the scholarship. I got a flight to Cape Town so I could see my comrades from Cape Town. And I was first time in this posh hotel. So literally at that moment in my life, I was like, hey, who cares whether I get the scholarship? I made it to Cape Town and they paid for me to come and so on. And I was really relaxed, gave honest answers. One of the questions they asked me was, if you were made the Minister of Education, how will you solve the education crisis? And me, like, very calmly said, thank you for the question, but that's a very naive question. Because that assumes that the education crisis exists outside of the fact that we're living in an authoritarian regime where we don't have democracy. So, like, bottom line is, if you combine the compassion of Mahatma Gandhi with the militancy of Che Guevara and the intelligence of Albert Einstein and put them in one person. I apologize to all three of them, just as it came out war men. But if you combine all of that in one person and made the Minister of Education, there's no way they're going to fix the problem. Because also I should tell you that my most important academic achievement is that I set a record at Oxford for taking the longest to ever complete a PhD. I started in 87, only graduated in 2000, sort of like almost 30 years later. That's my only academic achievement.
But it's okay. I think
I did a few other things. Along the way.
I think going back to kind of support or say one's country is a fair enough excuse. Okay. But I was wondering exactly, so you go as a Rhodes Scholar to the UK. How strong is the cultural shock?
Oh, exception is some. I tell this funny story about the first night I had to go to where the Rhodes Scholarships are. Ministers do something called Rhodes House. So like when the Queen goes to Oxford, she visits Rhodes House and all, So I stayed there for the first couple of days while I tried to figure out where I'm going to stay. And you cannot believe what a culture shock it was at so many levels. In fact, my first night, I'd been on the run before I fled, and I hadn't slept also for like days before I fled because of the adrenaline and things to do before I left and so on. And so when I get to this house, I go into the room on the third floor. The curtains were apart. I was too exhausted to think about it. And I think it was March of 87. I collapsed on the bed and I fall asleep with my clothes and so on. But my body knew that I made it out and I was safe. So finally my brain switched off and I slept from say 10 o'clock at night or 9:30 at night till 11 o'clock, which is like more than 12 hours. And so then suddenly there's a knock on the door, but I'd been on the run. So when I hear the knock, the worst thing when you're on the run from the police is if there's a knock on the door. So oh my God, I'm busted. So I wake up in a fright. And then I look ahead of me. It had snowed the night before. So I hadn't not witnessed snow in my life before. So I'm looking at that thing like, where am I? And then the door opens and a white woman walks in and says, "Excuse me, sir, can I bring you some tea and toast?" Oh, look at that snow. I'd never been called sir before by a black or white person. There was never a white woman in my room before. And I'd never been offered breakfast in bed before. For a brief moment, I thought, have I died and is this heaven? I must have looked so deranged to the wonderful woman who had come to offer me. I just looked at her, and then after, I think, 45 seconds, she said, "Excuse me, sir," and she left. So having come from the front lines of revolution against the oppressive regime, everything was a site of struggle, right? So when I get there to Oxford, I obviously gravitate to the people who had not only people from South Africa and Africa, but also exiles from Chile, exiles from Nicaragua, people who had stood up for a better society and they were paying the price for it. And after a while, I realized, actually, the struggle in South Africa is not totally exceptional. It had an exceptional feature of race, but actually people were facing brutal regimes all over the place. And then my time at Oxford became more and more manageable as I met more people who cared about society more than they cared about themselves. You know what I mean? Just because obviously I was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. I could, every after the first year, I was getting letters from McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, all these consulting companies offering me management track positions and so on, right?
Oh my God.
And I used to, whenever I received, I take one look and I'll throw it in the bin, right? Now people say, hey, you're an idiot, you should have done the thing, maybe you've got some skills and so on, maybe. But at that time, it was just not something. All I was focused on is, when can I make it back home, and when can I be back with friends and family and to contribute. And then, of course, it happened fast. Within 3 years of getting there, Sunday, I was sitting in a house in Oxford watching Nelson Mandela walk out of prison, with a whole bunch of South African exiles. I was very excited, and there was a sense of unreality seeing Mandela walk out of prison, because many of us thought he would die in prison. And so, even though he lost 27 years of his life, I'm still of the view that at least he came out alive and he contributed and showed us the way. But unfortunately, our current political leaders have betrayed him badly by embracing not just corruption, but what I call industrial scale looting.
Do you think you've had a sense of guilt actually in that time?
That I fled out. Absolutely. Absolutely. Because basically while I was there, my best friend gets murdered, right? Brutally murdered, so many bullets in his body, his parents couldn't recognize him. And then my brother comes out of, who by this stage is on the run. He comes out of hiding to go see the parents of our friend, and they say, can you take us to see the lawyer? They're trying to figure out how to get his body back and so on. And while he's taking them to go and see the lawyers, roadblock, because, there's lots of spies around, and he then ended up in prison for a year.
How do you process those emotions? Because I can understand that when you're in it, so many things are happening, you're a bit right in survival mode. So you kind of get used, I'm imagining, you kind of get used to the chaos, the violence. I think people don't even realize, right, the level of violence that we're talking about. But then you go to an environment that's calm. And I can imagine just at that point, probably your brain just starts processing a bit what's happening and your emotions, and you're kind of, I don't know, how did you actually process it? Looking back, yeah.
So, one of the things that has characterized my life is a very simple view that we're given one life to live, right? And you have to live it to the fullest. So there was a wisdom that I used to quote all the time. We shall walk this way but once. Any good, therefore, that we can do, let us do it now. Let us not neglect it or defer it, because we might never walk this way again. And I learned that as a teenager, and that just, I held on to it. And so I also was, at some level you could say it was quite boring, compared to the adrenaline sort of pace at which but I was learning new things all the time, seeing new places and meeting new people from different backgrounds. And of course, the people that gravitated to me were people who were concerned about economic justice and social justice and gender justice and all of that. So thankfully, I had some very good friends that I met while I was there, some of them from South Africa and Africa, others from other parts of the world. And I learned a lot from being just open to listening to their experiences and so on. But I would say, we all think that our own personal life journeys are not that interesting. Right? Because we've lived it.
Yeah.
Well, what's the big deal? You lived it and so on. The few delusional people who think their lives are the best thing. So me, I don't like. I just feel like I had the opportunity to make a difference. I took the opportunity. I'm glad I had the opportunity to do the difference. That many people, like say with the climate struggle right now, can't think about the end of the world from climate change because they have to think about the end of the month and putting food on the table for their kids.
Yeah.
Right? So I'm glad that even though I've lived simply all my life, I've not accumulated wealth, I've made the decisions that I felt was consistent with what we struggle for, especially what many people died for. So like my friend Lenny, used to say in my last conversation with him, he asked me, what's the biggest contribution we can make to society? And I said, giving our lives. I mean, getting shot and killed and becoming a martyr. I said, I guess so. He said, no, it's not giving your life, but giving the rest of your life. I was 22 years old that time. I don't know what the hell he was talking about because he was way ahead of us. In fact, I jokingly say at that time, Lenny was probably like one of 5,000 voluntary vegetarians on the entire African continent. He was one of the few people who understood the intersection between racial justice and environmental justice. And so anyway, when he gets brutally killed together with 3 young women from my home city, which was one of the biggest losses I felt. And that was hard. Yeah. Wherever I was in the world, it was going to be hard even if I was at home. But being alone without anybody from my common experience, it was excruciatingly painful to manage that. And I had to think deeply about what he was saying when he said, give you the rest of your life. Basically, he was saying the struggle for justice is a marathon, not a sprint. And as we've seen throughout the world, even the most courageous anti-colonial leaders and liberation fighters and all of that, when they taste power, as I've seen with the ANC in South Africa, power goes completely to their head. And even though they can still say things about how committed they are to the people, they are serving their own interests quite often.
Which actually brought me to a thought because I was wondering, is that even ever avoidable, right? Like, I think we go back a bit to maybe like how our systems are built globally. But I do wonder, is the issue really sometimes with the individuals that we blame, or is the issue really with the fact that like maybe one individual just should never have this much power, right? Systemically.
Yeah. Basically, they say, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Power should always be devolved. That's the safest bet. Anything of value, anything that can determine the journeys of other people, you should not have too much of. And it's totally unhealthy for any society that somebody has far too much of centralized power. We were very, very, in the way we were brought up in the liberation struggle, we're about collective leadership, not individual leadership and so on. But you could have that in the theory and you could have it a little bit in your practice. But at the end of the day, conventional notions of leadership still prevail, right?
Yeah.
We sang the names of our leaders that were in prison in the hope that they will liberate us. Until more and more our leaders are saying, freedom is in your hands. It's not in ours. That you have to, and that message of freedom is in your hands is still a message I believe is relevant today. Right? Bad as the world might be right now with the right-wing shifts in governments all over the world, the rise of fascism, climate denialism, all of that, there is still a sense that when there is injustice, there are sufficient levels of alienation that good, decent people will say, enough is enough and no more. I'm prepared to put my life on the line. I'm prepared to go to prison if necessary. And the right thing to do is for me to stand up against injustice, even if I have to suffer consequences. And the suffering of consequences, going to prison, getting banned, and all of that. My brother was in prison, was banned. Banned meant twice a day you had to go to the police station and sign, right? And that he couldn't leave home from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. But, and our houses were monitored by police and so on. So, but of course you could get around that. You just have a pump-up door, and you put the pump-up door by the, not that pump-up doors are that easily available in those days. Not that I ever had a pump-up door, by the way. But my brother used to create a sense that there was somebody there and slip out to the back, go do his activism, slip back in and so on. My brother was the national vice president of the students' movement, which was in those days like one of the highest levels of leadership you could reach. And I'm very proud of his activism, learned a lot from it. One funny thing was when I was fleeing South Africa, I was 22, he was 21. And everybody used to refer to him as Kumi's brother, right? When I came back 3 years later, everybody referred to me as COVID's brother because he was now the high-profile student leader.
I was wondering actually, so you go from a very on-the-ground activism, right? And also probably, you're every day in this struggle, etc. And then at some point you become also basically director of Greenpeace. How is it to shift from a type of, obviously Greenpeace did a lot of civil disobedience, etc., but it's still very different, right? You're still still having to handle like bureaucracy, etc. How was that shift in terms of work? What did that mean for you?
So when I go home from Oxford, I begin to help building Mandela's movement to wait for the elections. And then in the process of that, I became very clear I wasn't going to go into government and that we needed to rebuild civil society because the joke then was the term NGO stood for next government official, not governmental organization. Because of the transition happened, so many people moved from the NGO sector into government, which was a good thing because the NGO sector was like the informal human resource development agency of the country, because you were thrown in the deep end with very limited experience and then you had to learn, right? So if you look at from the cabinet to the members of parliament to senior civil servants, junior civil servants, most of the people were trained in the NGO sector. They got the experience, right? So then after working in adult literacy for about 3-4 years, I then led and was the founding executive director of the South African NGO Coalition. And then from there, from the NGO Coalition, I then get headhunted to be the Secretary General of Civicus, World Alliance for Citizen Participation, which was like a global version of the South African NGO Coalition, basically an organization that advocated for the freedom of association, assembly, and expression, and so on. And then after that, I get headhunted by Greenpeace, and then I end up in Amsterdam for 6 years leading Greenpeace. It was a big adjustment because of the bureaucracy and the size of it, right? And the kind of scale of funding and so on. But my overall sense is that smaller organizations, much less resources, are much more effective in being impactful if you look at it proportionally speaking, right? For the amount of resources that any international NGO has and the impact it has is completely disproportional to the amount of money invested and what the output is. But if you have a small NGO focus on one thing in one area doing this, they usually have very limited resources and they are able to have impact. The sad reality is that even though 88% of the people in the world live in the global south and every 9 out of 10 people in the world is a person of color, international NGOs don't get anywhere close to reflecting that reality. So everybody knows that even leaders of the international NGOs who are predominantly from the global north and wide they concede that the organizations are deeply structurally racist.
Mm-hmm.
And if you keep saying, well, it's just structural racism, that by structural racism in the NGO sector, it means, like, for example, at Greenpeace, when I started, all of Africa had one vote and Luxembourg had one vote in the global decision making. All of China would have one vote and Belgium will have one vote. All of India will have one vote and, Switzerland would have one vote. And if you look at the population sizes and so on, it's crazy. But the same logic of $1, one vote prevailed. So even though I started processes of changing that, if you look at who has power in these institutions even today, they're disproportionately from the global south, global north, right? And so we should remind ourselves, I think, what Mahatma Gandhi once said when he said, be the change you want to see in the world. If you want to create a different kind of global reality, then organizations who have good values, good visions, good missions, good programs even, have to walk the talk. They can't say, we support equity and justice, and your institution doesn't reflect equity and justice in practice. Mm-hmm. And so I would say, and I've said this publicly before, the international NGO community has a long way to go before they are fully kept with the program and before they can reflect the realities of what the world looks like, right? I mean, you can't have a situation where if 9 out of 10 people in the world are people of color, and you put the term international behind everything, Oxfam International, Greenpeace International, Save the Children International, Amnesty International. As my predecessor at Amnesty said, when he brought his management team to visit me when I was at Greenpeace in Amsterdam, he said, I've come to realize why all these institutions are called, his name is Salil Shetty, he's from India, why all these organizations call themselves international. He said, because they're masking how un-international in reality they actually are. So whoever's listening to this who finds himself working for this, for one or other of the international NGOs, I would say to you, you have a moral responsibility to make your organizations, if you're using the term international, then let your organization get as close to reflecting what the reality of the world looks like, which sadly almost all international NGOs have a long journey to go before they get anywhere close to reflecting that.
I know now you're working on a treaty. Is that for you like a form of systemic change? Like
totally.
Concrete?
So basically, my focus right now is on what we need for humanity's survival. So the good news I will share with your listeners and viewers is that the planet does not need saving. The planet is just fine. If you continue on the suicidal path that we are on, our addiction to fossil fuels, oil, coal, and gas, which is 80% plus of the cause of climate change, then the result is we warm up the planet to the point where we destroy our soil, we destroy our water resources. It's so hot. Already the case where you can't safely do agriculture because things burn to the ground and so on. When that intensifies and becomes ultra normal, the end result is we will be gone, the planet will still be here. So everybody is worried about saving the planet. Chill. Because once we become extinct as a species, the forests will go back, the oceans will replenish, and so on. So don't worry about saving the planet. Understand that the threat of climate change, driven by our addiction to oil, coal, and gas, right, is nothing more and nothing less than protecting our children and their children's future. And that is why we have to say it's completely unacceptable that we've been negotiating annually for like 4 weeks in a year, ending with 2 weeks, face-to-face for a climate solution. And it takes us 28 years before even the term fossil fuels is mentioned in a climate conference COP outcome document. That's as absurd as Alcoholics Anonymous having 2-week annual conferences for almost 30 years, and it takes them 28 years before they mention the word alcohol in the outcome document. Or put differently, because the reason why that's the case is because the biggest delegation to the conferences is not United States or Europe, but it is the fossil fuel lobbyists are the largest delegation. So that's, again, as absurd as Alcoholics Anonymous, having a global conference, and the largest delegation to the conference is the alcohol industry, right? So right now, we've been going year in, year out with these climate negotiations. And in Copenhagen in 2009, when I joined Greenpeace, we went there saying we want a fab deal. Not a fabulous deal, but a fair, ambitious, and binding deal. But what we got then and every year subsequently is a FLAB deal, F-L-A-B, full of loopholes and bullshit, right? And so we need something which is binding, where we get governments, as we've had a nuclear non-proliferation treaty, and as we had the landmines treaty, we need a treaty where governments come and agree and negotiate. One, we will, knowing what we now know, we will not invest 1 cent more in oil, coal, and gas. And thankfully, we have options: solar, wind, geothermal, micro hydro, biomass, and so on. Secondly, we then need governments to say, okay, we will phase out of fossil fuels, but we'll do it in this fastest possible period. And the third thing is we want to do it in a fair, just, inclusive way. Because it's not fair now for countries that did not build their economies on dirty energy through fossil fuels, that they just be told, you just have to shut down. Because the workers that work in oil, coal, and gas companies, for example, they're not our enemy, they're our brothers and sisters. Right? The people at the top in the management have been lying about the science and so on. By the way, you know who were the first scientists in the world to know that fossil fuels, oil, coal, and gas contributes to climate change? The scientists of the oil and gas companies. And you know that? If you go look at the height of the drilling platforms that they put in the ocean, it's been raising in lead because height, because they took into account sea level rise. But publicly they were saying, oh no, these people are lying and all of that. Now no fossil fuel company denies that their activity and product is driving climate change. But where the difference is now, they want to drag it out to the end of the century, 2100. But the science says we have to stay within 1.5 degrees. What that means, I know that's a jargon for some of your viewers and listeners. So from the start of the Industrial Revolution, from the time that we started burning oil, coal, and gas, from that time into the future, they say we cannot have more than a 1.5 degree collective temperature rise. We're already at 1.5. And that's why we are seeing such extreme weather events, such a high loss of human life. You know, my home city, Durban, in 2022, in 2 days, 450 people died as a result of just flooding on a scale we've never seen, as a result of like just massive amounts of rain. So, I think this might be my last rodeo, as they say. I've started it in January, in September, and I'm very excited that even though the cards are stacked against us, we've got serious momentum. We've got 16 countries that have endorsed. More and more countries are inquiring about how to endorse. And we don't need everybody to agree immediately. If we get a cluster of 30 countries to get together, put out the first draft, it'll be a case of if you build it, they will come. If you set it up, then countries are not going to be wanting to be left out. But there's a very high level of cognitive dissonance, which is basically a denial of reality, right? And the problem is oil, coal, and gas companies, if you don't mind me saying, are making shitloads of money from the current system. So they're going to try and extend it for as long as possible. There are a lot of leaders of the fossil fuel industry that get fantastically wealthy at the expenses of the poor. But the social license for oil, coal, and gas company is fast being pulled away from them through popular resistance. And the fossil fuel treaty is going to intensify the process. And I'm glad to say that all over the world, people are resisting and standing up in ways that is irresistible now. Leaders cannot resist.
No, I think hearing about your life, I think that like a lot of people would probably think that that is what gives you, right, the courage to be the activist that you are. I mean, I think that when we hear all the overwhelming evidence about climate change, about social inequality, about, I mean, just on my phone, the amount of violence that I see on a regular basis, right, through social media, a lot of people probably feel completely overwhelmed and don't know where to start. And in fact, we had a conversation with my colleague Davide, because when I spoke about interviewing you and we looked at your life, and he was like, okay, so what's my struggle? I'm lactose intolerant, or what is going to be?
Don't underestimate lactose intolerance. It could be a bugger.
But so my question would be, can anyone become an activist?
Absolutely.
Like in view?
Absolutely. And we need to redefine activism. Right? Activism, you don't have to be as mad as me to be an activist. You don't have to go occupy oil rigs and give up big salaries and live simply and as extreme as I live in a low income neighborhood in South Africa, and it's about choice, and it's about saying, how can I be an authentic leader if I'm living a life of privilege, which I can easily get because I got a PhD from Oxford, I'm a Rhodes Scholar, etc., right? But we have to redefine activism. My sister, who sadly died at the age of 56 from an aggressive brain tumor at 56, nobody described her as an activist. But to my brother and I, who everybody describes as activists, she was the one who enabled our activism. So as far as I'm concerned, she was just as much as activist as us. If we were going to go and spray free Nelson Mandela slogans, graffiti, she was saying, okay, my husband sleeps at such and such a time. I'll leave the key on the windowsill. Don't come before 2 and don't come return the keys after 4. That was an act of activism. Right now, we have to look at multiple pathways to people being able to participate. If you're a school teacher who teaches art, then use your art to do murals in the community with young kids that says messages of justice, hope, unity, climate action, and so on. Don't put that teacher to sit in a boring meeting to talk about the constitution of the organization and things where they don't. We have to make activism to be enjoyable, right? Do your activism in a way that you sing, you dance, you laugh, you build community and be happy. Don't allow the Donald Trumps of the world to strip you of your right to happiness and so on. Our son, whose name was Ricardo, but his stage name was Ricky Rick, was a very popular hip-hop artist and rapper who took his life 3 years ago. 6 weeks before he committed suicide, he asked his mom and I, he tells his mom and I, you guys are really not good at what you do, because they've been fighting since teenagers for human rights, democracy, and sustainability, gender equity, and so on. And when I look at the world, everything is moving in the wrong direction. So why don't you just chill, spend the time that you should have spent with us rather than running around the world unsuccessfully trying to save the world. And then when I asked him, why do you think we're failing? He said, because you all think you can move people by aiming all your narratives at the brain and you'll ignore the heart, the body, and the soul.
I also then was listening on my way to your son's music, Ricky Rick, and I was thinking it's so interesting how now music has not become necessarily a way of struggle, as in against a specific oppressor, but has become a way of asserting. I mean, I was wondering, how do you feel when you listen to kind of modern music now? Is that a form of activism?
Firstly, just in the 1980s, there were 2 types of music that we were very inspired by. One was liberation music. So yes, Maria Makeba, but also just freedom songs that we sang in large numbers, and we got a lot of motivation out of it. But the music that we danced to was reggae. Right? So reggae was our thing, man, like all of us were Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, basically, of course, their music spoke to our experience and spoke to oppression and so on. But I think that what Ricky taught me was you don't have to always be obvious to make a point.
Yeah.
Right? Nobody would say that Ricky was like a major revolutionary musician by any means. But like, I'll show you something, right? Okay, I'm not going to undress, but I'm going to show you a T-shirt, right? So this is a T-shirt. I wasn't thinking I was going to do this, but this is a T-shirt of Ricky, which talks about a song. Can you see it? Stay Shining.
Well, we can. Yeah.
So Stay Shining was one of his most popular songs, right? Nobody would say it's a political song, but actually at the heart of it, the message was the world is a tough place. You have to struggle, you have to hustle, you have to hassle, but you can be the best version of yourself if you stay shining, stay positive, believe in yourself. Don't let anybody get you down. And that message for me today, I wouldn't have understood it like that when I was growing up, but that message for me is a quintessentially political message of our moment. To say to people, you don't have to believe that your voice doesn't matter. You don't have to believe that you can't change your circumstances. Believe that you can and be as positive as you can, whether you live in extreme poverty or whether you don't. You have the best chance to be the best version of yourself when you stay positive. And so for me, well, at that moment in history, we got a lot from music. But I think in this moment where we are now, we have to recognize the misinformation and disinformation that's going on and who controls Twitter and who controls the global media and so on. And we can see that the bigger problem we face is not the repressive state apparatus, army, police, formal rule, but the biggest threat we face right now is the ideological state apparatus. The framework for education, the framework for the funding of arts and culture, the framework for religion, and most importantly, the framework for communications and media. And today, Elon Musk can do whatever he wants and get away with it, even when he's telling colossal lies with it, even when he's giving Nazi salutes and so on, just because he's a rich white guy from South Africa or the richest guy in the world. And so I think there is a change in the moment we are. We need activism, arts, culture, and activism brought together, which combines in a way that gives people a sense of informed hope. And one thing I would say to your viewers and listeners, the moment of history we find ourselves in right now, pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford. And the pessimism that justifiably emerges from our analysis, our lived experience, and our observations can, must, and should be responded to by the optimism of our thought, our actions, our creativity, our sense of humanity, and our compassion. There are people like Elon Musk and Donald Trump who are banking on us believing that we cannot change anything. If we accept that, then they have won. So long as we believe, however tough, however many setbacks we're having right now, so long as we hold on to the hope that the world that we live in cannot be the best that humanity can create for itself. If anybody tells me this is the best world we can live in with so much of inequality, violence, and so on, then you just have to say you've got absolutely no ambition, right? So we have to have a mentality that says we have to keep a sense of optimism and we have to keep a sense of purpose. It doesn't mean there are not going to be days when you feel devastated. God knows I have many of those days, right? But you have to be able to pick yourself up and you have to be able to stay shining.
Wow, I love that. My last question, and it was inspired by Rodriguez. What do you actually still wonder about?
Oh, I wonder.
Yeah, exactly.
I often wonder how different the world would be if we did not have slavery, if we did not have colonialism,
And if the so-called civilized, or the people who thought they were civilized, had not developed nuclear weapons and other sophisticated military stuff, if we didn't have all of those things, how would the world have been? Right? I really wonder that a lot, you know. I wonder, this didn't need to be this way. And the arrogance of white supremacy is probably one of the worst things we've had that brought us down this path. And I now wonder, is it fair that the burden of changing things lies with those that have been on the wrong side of history or been on the receiving end of injustice? And they are the very ones today who not only have to liberate themselves, but as we have to do in South Africa, also have to liberate those with, in our case, the oppressor and those with privilege today. Because actually, basically, whether we like it or not, we have to liberate the CEOs of the fossil fuel companies. I mean, I'll tell you this, those CEOs of oil, coal, and gas companies, already their children are asking them, Dad, well, usually it's dad, by the way, very few moms, head of fossil fuel companies. Dad, how can you dig your head in the sand? My future is at stake. You're taking yes, you're making a lot of money, and yes, you give me a lot of privilege, but what are the consequences? And so finally I say, I wonder what it would take